Hi everybody. In this short mini lecture, we're gonna talk about a little bit this idea of what is terrorism and how do we define it and why do we want to define it. Hopefully you've read chapter 2 in the book, and that should be the background for this week, for this unit. And if you read the chapter, and even if you didn't, open the book on page 28 and 29. What you find there is number of different definitions of terrorism. There are many things that are in common between them, but there are also some differences. Some of them are subtle, some of them might seem as more important. But I think the one thing that I want you to get out of this is that even though some countries or as the human community, we have been dealing with terrorism for many, many years, we really don't have one accepted definition of what terrorism is. There has been some efforts in the UN several times to come up with a definition of what terrorism is, in a similar way that we have an international definition to what piracy is. But with terrorism, it just doesn't go. Not everybody agrees. Not everybody can get to a consensus and say, this is terrorism. But if I see it, I know it is terrorism. Furthermore, if you read the chapter, you know that even inside the US government, or any other government for that matter, different agencies, different parts of the government have different definitions of what terrorism is. Now, I guess one question is, why does it matter? Why is it important to define what terrorism is? And the answer is that there are implications in terms of who deals with that, if there's an investigation, who investigates, if you cut someone and accuse them with terrorism, what kind of trial are they standing on, who tries them, and what kind of punishment they can receive. How is that different than crime? Than other forms of crime? I guess that's another question that we need to ask ourselves. And the answers tend to be somewhat different in different places, and depending on the agency and the context of what we are talking about. It also matters because even though some of you say, well, this whole discussion about definition is just semantics, it's just an academic or a theoretical discussion. There could be some to that, but also for many people around the world, it matters. And terrorism is a reality of life, and so they need to know what they are dealing with and who they are dealing with, right? It's also important to know who is a terrorist. So when you cut somebody in Afghanistan, are they a prisoner of war? Are they a criminal? Are they a terrorist? Depending on how you answer that question, there's a number of different avenues that you can go ahead and deal with that person, and what kind of legal protections that person has on them, right? If you look at the book in page 32, I have the book in front of me here, so I'm looking at it as I go. They have a list of different types of terrorism: state terrorism, descendant terrorism, which is the one that we most commonly call terrorism, religious terrorism, ideological terrorism, international terrorism, criminal dissident terrorism. And throughout the semester we will touch on many of those and try to understand specifically what is the relationship or what is the religious motivation for some terror groups, and why some religions seem to be encouraging more of that action than others. But take a look on those types of terrorism and start to think about your own take on each one of those. There are, when we discuss defining terrorism, we always get to this question of what is the difference between terrorism and crime. And more specifically, if you look at specific types of crime, so hate crimes, for example, are hate crime terrorism? Is terrorism hate crime? Now, the way I think is best to think about that is as a Venn diagram, right? Where you have one circle which stands for terrorism, another circle which stands for hate crimes, and there is some overlapping in between them. So some hate crimes are terrorism and some terrorism is hate crime, but not all hate crimes are terrorism, because a lot of hate crimes have no political agenda behind them. And some terrorism is not hate crime because it is purely politically motivated, and hence it doesn't target any specific group, but power structure more in general, right? So there is some overlap between them, but they're not the same thing. And in the case of the United States, and we see here, it's statistically has been shown that we have more mass shooting than in any other countries. Again comes the question, is any and every incident of mass shooting an act of terrorism? And the answer again is no, because a lot of the criminals who carry a mass shootings are not motivated by a political goal, by a political agenda, are not necessarily targeting civilians, and any of those other parts that you see come up again and again and again in a definition of terrorism. And then the other thing that we need to kind of know is that terrorism, regardless if it's ideological or religious, state or dissident, whatever it is, comes from a point of view of political extremism. This idea that my opinion is right and everybody else is wrong, to the point that I am not accepting it. There's complete intolerance to any other definition of the situation. So if you're not with me, we are at war, and I am ready to harm you. This is political extremism, and that is usually goes hand in hand with terrorism, or kind of the first step before a group or an individual goes into terrorism is that they identify with political extremism, right? Political extremism mostly uses generalization, so all that group is, right? So we are kind of, think about the latest discourse in the United States between left and right. So if you say all Trump voters are, that is generalization. And if you're not willing to accept or hear what they have to say, you are getting close to political extremism. That doesn't make you a terrorist, and of course that doesn't mean that you are willing to use violence, but you are getting to that level of intolerance. Same thing from the other side. If you come from the right and look at the left and say that all Democrats are X, again, it's that, making those generalization, a lot of time going hand in hand with different conspiracy theories. This is the root. So political extremism is the root of terrorism, all types of terrorism. And we kind of established that things like hate crimes could be terrorism, but they're not always are. So terrorism is a separate category, right? The chapter 2 that you read is then think about different ways to conceptualize terrorism that are not necessarily a two-sentence definition. You can find those out there, but there are other ways to think about it and conceptualize it. I really like the part in pages 33 and 34 that uses the 4 quotes, starting with the very well-known quote that says, one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. This is mainly saying that terrorism, or if something is terrorism or not, depends on the perspective of your own perspective, right? And this is, again, that perspective distinction is why we cannot get to a unanimously accepted definition of what terrorism is. The second quote there says that one man willing to throw his life is enough to terrorize 1,000. And that talks about the rule of small numbers. If you look at all terror attacks, terror groups, right? We're talking about very, very small groups. This is not, 9/11 was not carried out by an army of 10,000 people. It was a group of about 20 attackers, terrorists, that were supported by maybe another 20 or 30. But still, we're talking about very, very small numbers. But they are resolute and they are willing to pay the ultimate price with their life. And that scares us. That will terrorize us because you cannot stop them. Later on in the class, we talk about counterterrorism, but something that we learn is that once a suicide terrorist is out to carry a mission, it is extremely hard to stop it from happening. You might be able to minimize the damage, such as was done in the Kabul airport attacks last week. Still very damaging, but the attacker did not get inside the terminal or inside an airplane, right? So we were able to minimize the damage, but you cannot stop a person that's willing to kill himself or herself, and already carrying the explosives on them. The third quote there, saying that extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice. This is this idea that the goal justifies the means. And we can see that repeating in many different contexts, even in the American Revolutionary context, right? This idea that there are things such as liberty or freedom that we should be willing to take any and all action in order to protect them. So that takes us back to political extremism, which is once again a step towards or at the root of terrorism. Right? And then finally, the quote that says, it became necessary to destroy the town to save it. And this is this idea that sometimes the damage or the destruction or suffering that you can inflict on people, even people that you are working for, is better than giving up to a power structure, or than the village falling to an occupation of the enemy. So at that point, we are willing to use violence even against our own people, because we believe that the alternative is so much worse, right? And so these quotes kind of can put you in the frame of mind of how there are different ways to think about and understand terrorism, right? You can look at a terror attack from the point of view of the planners, of the attackers, those that are carrying it out, the victims, those that were targeted, the terrorized victims. So, you know, whenever there's an attack, there are those who are immediately being impacted because they were injured or killed or witnessed it firsthand. And then there is the terrorism, the terrorizing impact about the society or the community all around them, right? And so we can think about terrorism from all of those different points of view. There are also people who might believe in one of those quotes, such as the one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter, not quite willing to take the action themselves, so they will not carry out the attacks, but they're willing to support terrorism in many different ways. Right nowadays, if there's a terror group and you are just speaking up their cause or protecting their cause, you are already supporting them. Of course, there are other ways to financially support groups and organizations, etc. And so what I want you to take from chapter 2, I want you to take that there is a big and large discussion about how do we define terrorism, and that it's not very clear cut. And from the few points that I raised here, I want you to take this notion that you can and should think about terrorism from different points of view, and that it matters what the context is, what is your perspective, what are the goals of the organization, and then we can think about, is terrorism ever justified, right? Later in the class, we are going to think about who becomes a terrorist, why are people turning into terrorists, and so with this conversation and thought about what is terrorism, you can start and kind of put the seeds into those future discussions and start to think about what are your opinions about any of those quotes, any of those different conceptualizations of what terrorism is. So a lot to think about. Go back to reading, and I'll see you next time.